you're used to, where artists have recorded songs and messages so that you'll be able to watch those. And then also you'll be able to schedule your payments. You could schedule them now, but you could also do so during that May 27th concert. So you can watch that on YLC's Facebook page as well as YouTube channel. So links are throughout YLC's website, as well as some emails that have been going out to members and non-members alike. So while the concert series was unfortunately canceled that we're all aware of, we're still excited to be able to have this offering to our members as well as the community as a whole. Great. Yeah. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our two speakers today. So the first one up here is Mr. Quentin Messer, who is the president and CEO of the New Orleans Business Alliance. So as the CEO, Quentin leads the initiatives and programs related to making New Orleans an attractive city for its size and for financial and human capital investment. These initiatives and programs are conducted across four kind of areas that just to highlight: business attraction and retention, small business growth, talent and workforce development, and then strategic neighborhood development. So some accolades for Mr. Messer include Business New Orleans Person of the Year, Consultants Connect as one of the North America's top 50 economic developers, and selected by Ebony Magazine for its Ebony Power 100 as a power player. Immediately prior to joining the New Orleans Business Alliance, Quentin was the Assistant Secretary for Louisiana Economic Development, the State Department of Economic Development. So that was Mr. Quentin Messer there. And not to be outdone, we have also Mr. Nolan Marshall, who is the Chief Engagement and Solution Officer for New Orleans Business Alliance. Nolan is responsible for representing NOLA BA and the business community with public partners and elected officials at the local, state, and federal level. He leads the Business Alliance's small business growth, strategic neighborhood development, and industry attraction and retention teams, an integrated approach to create an adaptive and equitable economy that benefits all New Orleanians and is a beacon for the region. Some of Mr. Marshall's civic engagement has included the chair of the New Orleans City Planning Commission, president of Einstein Charter School Board of Directors, a gubernatorial appointee to the New Orleans Bio District, and possibly the best one is he's a former president of the Young Leadership Council. So quite exciting there. So very excited to have both of these individuals here. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll monitor them throughout. But with that being said, I will stop talking and let Mr. Messer and Mr. Marshall take it away. Thanks, guys.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. I am very grateful to YLC and you, Andrew, and the rest of your team for affording us this opportunity. I've got a PowerPoint presentation. I think what we'll do is I want to try to get through the PowerPoint in between 10 and 12 minutes. And then I want to turn it over to Nolan for comments or responding to maybe the PowerPoint for maybe, an equal amount of time, and then we can open it up, Andrew, for a broader discussion, if that makes sense. Nolan, you're cool with that? All right. Lisa, beam me up or beam up the presentation for us. And I want to thank Lisa Hellrich, is a colleague of Nolan and ours, and really is the woman who is really responsible for keeping me on track. Let me try to frame what I'm going to discuss. This is a presentation I adapted. I'm on the Louisiana Legislative Task Force for Reopening the Economy. So really, the perspective from New Orleans was the title of this. This has been adapted for this audience. But really, there is a difference in perspective between how New Orleans has experienced COVID-19 and maybe a lot of the rest of the state. We can talk about that a little later. So I want to talk about some of the direct relief efforts that we at the Business Alliance have undertaken. I also want to talk about employment and considerations toward reopening an ultimately better Louisiana economy. Next slide, please. So I always believe in giving bad news first and always then moving to end on a higher note with a measure of hope. So this is kind of what our living, what we're experiencing right now. You can see um, the too many of our friends and neighbors are feeling the brunt of of what has happened, and this has not just been only in tourism hospitalities, but it's affected a number of sectors that I think we previously thought were going to be a bit more immune from the immediate ravages of COVID-19. So you've got what you see there is a presentation of unemployment claims from New Orleans, the state of Louisiana, and then the United States. And you can see the spike um, on the last week of March. These unemployment claims come out. There's a week lag, and they come out on Thursday mornings. So that is sort of um, what you see there. Next slide, please. Labor force participation in some respects is maybe even more interesting number. It's really unemployment measures those folks who are actively seeking employment and may not have not been able to locate it. Labor force participation shows those folks who are employed, actively seeking employment, but it also considers those folks who may have decided that they're just psychologically fatigued and have decided to opt out of the former or formal labor market. So you can see obviously the change over the first quarter. There's about a quarter lag, and we'll really see the full impact post COVID on these numbers as we get the April and May figures. Next slide, please. So this is really interesting. And my colleague Omar Stanton, shout out to him. He's our assistant vice president for data analysis and performance management. He's really been going to track unique job postings. And I think that that is really important because what that tells you is the underlying health of the economy. It means, are you going to be able to, once you reopen, some people believe that it's going to be whiz bang and we're going to go right back to where we were in February. Unfortunately, I don't think that's the case. And I think that there's going to be a long road ahead of us. And these unique job postings sort of point that out. And what this has said is that there's been a markedly more drastic decrease here in New Orleans than in the nation and the state, which is to be expected because our four largest industries are tourism, hospitality, maritime, oil and gas, and agribusiness. And candidly, the first three sectors, tourism, hospitality, maritime, and oil and gas, are very vulnerable to COVID-19 and future pandemics. And all four are very vulnerable to something that is being discussed less, but I think we have to be very sensitive to, is really changes in consumer behavior and change in underlying economic structure globally based upon climate change. Next slide, please. Advertised job postings by occupation. This gives you a sense of where is the health? Where are those occupations that may be most likely to recover? As you can see, there's been a market decrease from February to April, as you would expect. And we'll be tracking this over time. But what this shows us is that even in our ability, and we're very grateful for the diversification into technology and other sectors, no sector has been immune from the ravages of not only public health and the tragedy of the lost lives and the family impacted from that, but also the economic cost of COVID-19. Next slide, please. So let me sort of pivot now and talk a little bit about the Business Alliance has done in response to this unprecedented tragedy. As an economic development organization, most economic development organizations focus on structural change and don't really do direct assistance to members of the general public. we realized that we were in an unprecedented time and we really needed to try to come alongside and provide assistance, but we didn't want it to be duplicative. So we really launched the Gig Economy Workers Relief Fund. I can tell you more about the tremendous, overwhelming, and heartwarming response we've gotten. And we really wanted to focus on the gig economy. So the gig economy is dependent on the city's cultural calendar. These are folks who depend on festivals. This would have been among their most lucrative time of year, really from the beginning of March through July 4th and the Essence Festival. It includes rideshare drivers, musicians, arena workers, culture bearers, festival promote staff, freelancers, and many, many more folks. And these are 1099 contracting folks. They are not employees of anyone, and they typically lack access to minimum wage, paid sick leave, overtime pay, and standard benefits that are those for folks who are employed and receive W-2s during tax time. Next slide, please. So why is the gig economy so important? Estimated 16 million people nationally, more than a quarter of the workers participate in the gig economy in some capacity, and nearly 10% of the workforce here in Orleans Parish, which is coterminous with New Orleans, as you know. Next slide, please. So the Gig Economy Worker Relief Fund, we launched this formally on Monday, March 16th. The Business Alliance leveraged $100,000 of our own funding. The grant details, we are making 500 or have made $500 grants. And eligibility are residents of Orleans Parish who receive regular income from the gig economy and demonstrate loss due to COVID-19. So we realized we were not going to be able to serve everyone, but we really wanted to try to have a response to, at the time, and you have to think about this, this is pre-CARES Act, people who may not have received any benefits from any type of economic relief package. Next slide, please. The second of our direct relief efforts was Get Shift Done for NOLA. We received a $250,000 grant from Conrad Hilton Foundation. And really it's accomplishing the opportunity to have those, particularly young folks, opportunity youth, and others who are economically vulnerable, even pre-COVID-19, who really are now jobless, provide them the opportunity to earn $10 per hour, filling critical roles for providing meals to ill, homeless, and families deeply impacted by COVID-19. One of the things that's been very illustrating, but also I wouldn't say distracting, but distressing, is the level of food insecurity that we were dealing with pre-COVID-19, and that's only been exacerbated post-COVID-19. Next slide, please. So in summary, the next is really focused upon small business. As was mentioned in intro, one of our 4 traditional work streams is working and promoting small business growth. Nolan is directly responsible for supervising that effort with a private donation from an anonymous business. We set up Project HVAC, which provided a bridge loan program to help small businesses while they were waiting the economic injury disaster loan from the SBA and or PPP loan. Now remember, this was set up at a particular moment in time. So the thought process was, you have already applied for EIDL or PPP, but you still needed some bridge financing. And so this was intended to be a short-term loan. We didn't really publicize this because we realized, even from our work with the Gig Economy Workers Relief Fund and Get Shift Done, was that because of the scope of need, if you ran out of money or you didn't have enough, or it could just add and exacerbate frustration what people were seeing. So we were very focused and targeted. I'm grateful to say that we have put out $70,000 to the street. 5,000 has already come back. So we have a pool of $35,000 of dry powder to continue to lead to small businesses as we try to move forward. Next slide, please. So in a space of 6 months, the Business Alliance raised over $1.3 million in direct relief funds. The Gig Economy Worker Relief Fund, um, now close to $900,000. Get Shift Done, $350,000, and $100,000 from Project HVAC. So that's over $1.3 million in direct relief to try to help New Orleanians, whether business owners, gig economy workers, or folks who have been displaced from work in the hospitality industry. So we're very grateful for the community response, and just kudos to my colleagues for being innovative, responsive, and impactful. Next slide, please. So I want to try to sort of frame out, and maybe this may be an opening for questions. These are questions I considered when I was asked to be on the legislative task force to reopen the Louisiana economy. And I think we really need to bucket these in really three particular time windows. There's the immediate relief, which I think we've begun to exit from, and we're now migrated to intermediate recovery. We are phased reopening. We're trying to establish a different type of normalcy in a post COVID-19, a post pandemic world. And then we also have to think about the long term structural vulnerabilities that COVID-19 exposed. We knew they were there before, but they really exposed. So let me quickly look at, frame these questions, and then I'll turn over to Nolan to comment. Um, One of the things that we have to do is really, you can reopen a business, but if you haven't primed the pump on consumer demand, and getting people psychologically comfortable dining out, going back to retail, resuming their normal buying behavior, the state sales tax revenue is going to continue to be adversely affected. So that's one consideration. The next consideration is, because this is a public health emergency first and foremost, and because until we solve and give people confidence in the public health infrastructure and response, the economic response is really not going to be as fulsome as anybody hopes, because really this is about psychological safety and making people feel comfortable. Because the thing about COVID-19 and pandemics, and you can make some argument, even different aspects of climate change, they attack socialization. They attack the way that fundamentally we have grown to enjoy socializing, particularly in a place like New Orleans that is incredibly tactile. I mean, hugs and kisses and socialization and sharing drinks and digging into the same crawfish boil and getting crawfish and just eating gumbo from each other. That's just the way we do it, and that's why New Orleans is special. But this disease and future pandemics attack socialization. So we have to consider, do we subsidize temperature checks, squeeze guards, and other public health measures for small and medium-sized businesses? Because you are going to have to do that in order to get your demand. And then what city and state should we be benchmarking to see how successful has the New Orleans and Louisiana broader state economy reopened? There are certain cities that have been similarly hit because they have similar industry structure, whether it's Las Vegas, Nevada, Austin, Texas, although Austin is significantly more diversified, with the first closure in history of South by, Orlando, Florida, and Oklahoma City because of the exposure to oil and gas. My hypothesis is that one of the things that we'll see is Austin and Orlando may get out of the gate a bit faster because of economic diversification prior to COVID-19. And then, should neighboring parishes announce similar reopening plans? I think we certainly saw that, thankfully, through the phase one. But will that continue in phase 2 and 3? Because the virus does not respect parish boundaries, city boundaries, neighborhoods. It has no respect of those things. Let me talk about briefly some of the larger, longer term structural vulnerabilities. I think that one of the things I have recommended, whether it be enacted, is I think we need to establish a permanent joint public health economic recovery commission that provides guidance, tools, and funding to parishes to respond to future pandemics, climate change, natural and man-made disasters. Next week, we're going to enter the formal start of hurricane season. So we really, and this pretends to be a highly active one in the Atlantic. So we really need to be thinking about that. Secondly, how do we begin discussing the process of economic recovery and transformation that can similarly engage folks in New Orleans and folks in Ville Platte, folks in Jefferson Parish and folks in Union and Homer parishes in northern Louisiana? So we have to look at the commonalities while constructing policies that address the differences. Then the next point is the point that keeps me up at night is diversifying our economy. Trying not to be a me too state and just or city, hey, everybody's talking about software development, so let's jump into that. But let's be very surgically targeted about now that we have seen pandemics, climate change, what are those sectors of the economy? Is it industrial sterilization? Is it a more robust public health infrastructure? Is it telemedicine? What are those things that we need to really think about as we think about a robust pivot that our small and medium-sized businesses can make? Maybe should we be thinking about all of our restaurants being able to not only have or be considering takeout or maybe takeout order or delivery orders, but they should also be thinking about potentially bottling special sauces. Can we think about ways to put more of our culture workers, whether they be musicians, artists, culture bearers, online so people can enjoy them visually and virtually, even if they can't or don't feel comfortable flying to New Orleans? One of the things I want to say before I get to my last point is conservatively, 67% of the diners and the patrons in restaurants in New Orleans are not New Orleanians. So we are heavily dependent on making sure that people are psychologically comfortable. Initially, that's going to begin with drive radius, getting people comfortable in Arkansas, in Missouri, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, comfortable coming back. But ultimately, it's going to be very important for people who have been devastated in places like New York State, Illinois, California, comfortable European travelers, comfortable coming back to New Orleans. And the last point is, how do we craft the business case for targeted wealth and job creations for communities of color? Since we know that 33% of the state of Louisiana and obviously almost 55% of the city of New Orleans are African American, and then you add Latinos and or Latinx and folks from Southeast Asia to that, you get close to 60+%. But they disproportionately were overrepresented in not only the infections but also the tragic deaths from COVID-19. All of that inability for us to deal with some of the social determinants of health, some of the underlying economic vulnerabilities that our communities of color face have made us all collectively less prosperous as a state. Next slide, please. That's it. That's my information. I'm now going to turn it over to Nolan to push back on some of the things I've talked about or amplified on some of the themes I laid out. Nolan Marshall, former YLC president.
Thank you, Quentin. And I saw Stephanie's name pop up somewhere on there. Hey, Stephanie, how are you? One of the things that I love to do, just to give you a sense of kind of who I am before I get into my comment and my reflection, is every now and then I'll show up at Wednesdays at the Square and I'll go to the volunteer booth and I'll trouble some volunteer, meaning the volunteer booth, to tell me all about the organization and why I should join. And what you all do and why you're doing it. And I really give them a hard time because that's just me. But I'm not going to give Quentin a hard time. He did really well and sort of taking us through all the particulars and all the data and all the things that I hope have promoted or provoked some great questions. So I'll give us a lot of time to get into questions. Just as a way of reaction, I think about how 9 weeks ago, the week of March 7th, the Business Alliance was presenting before the City Council, and Council Member Jason Williams talked a lot about how the Business Alliance needed to be ahead of the curve. And in our exchanges back and forth, we talked about how really our role was to sort of race into the curve. We had to move fast. It wasn't enough. And I was probably thinking about my 4-year-old's Hot Wheel tracks around the house, that it's not enough to get ahead of the curve. You've got to really pick up some speed going into that curve. So you've got to be predictive about what's coming ahead, and you've got to run the traps extremely fast, and you've got to ask all the right questions, but then answer them quickly in order to get ahead of something like COVID. And so I'm also reflective around Slow Jams, one of my favorite Kanye West songs with Twista and Jamie Foxx. And Aisha Tyler in that song says, "I know you can do it fast, but I need you to do it a little bit faster." And that's when Twista comes in and he just takes off and he's going extremely fast. And for the Business Alliance, the last 8 weeks of standing up 3 programs that weren't in our original work plan, but met a need and a demand in the marketplace, were an example of us doing that, of moving extremely fast, of asking the questions of what segments of the community are going to be most at risk from this, and how do we help them? So small business folks, folks working in the gig economy, restaurant folks and hospitality folks who need to shift to new opportunities. And I'm also reflective of the last time really our community went through something like this was Hurricane Katrina. And shortly afterwards, we all started having similar conversations around how to diversify. And 4 years after Hurricane Katrina, we'd all sort of we'd started to rally around this idea that we should really be a biomedical hub in the city of New Orleans. We could pivot away from old Charity into a new VA building and into a new UMC hospital. And in 2009, this organization, the Young Leadership Council, partnered with the Urban League Young Professionals when I was president of this organization. And we did something that the YLC hadn't done in years, right? We took a public position on something that was a controversial project and said, we should build this new hospital in Mid-City. And it took probably, I don't remember exactly when construction broke ground on the hospital, but it was several years after we took that position. And it was many years after we realized that we needed to invest in biosciences, right? And so the hospitals have been built, but it's not until this year even that the bioscience district is attempting to create a TIF to capture value to build out the rest of the district beyond the hospitals. So we've been talking about our need to diversify in biosciences going back as far as immediately after Hurricane Katrina in 2006. And it's still on the radar of things to do as we run the traps, as we have conversations about how best to do it, as we try to build out the infrastructure. And my response to all the things that are in Quinn's presentation is that they are absolutely right. But as a community, we are in a race. And we use this analogy at the Business Alliance all the time. Sometimes we're talking about running hurdles, sometimes we're talking about the 800 meters, the 400 meters, or just the flat out sprint. And we will be in a competitive environment with every other city in the country, because COVID is unlike Katrina in that it's affected everybody. And everybody is talking about diversification. How do we get into being a part of the supply chain, of creating distribution centers, of taking advantage of even climate change and of investment in biosciences. And so for us as a community, it's going to be critically important that we do all the things that we've always done, make sure that we are trying to include underserved communities, or at least that conversation is taking place, that we are thinking intentionally about place where people live and where people work, that we are considering the environmental considerations, that we're asking all the questions and running all the traps, but we're going to have to do them significantly faster than we've ever done them, because we are in a competitive environment with every single other city who is also going to be running traps and analyzing how best to position themselves. And so it won't be the cities, in my belief, that get ahead of this thing are not going to be the ones that try to build out systems that respond to the normal as it was at the end of April and beginning of March, but who can predict sort of what the new normal might be. And there's risk in that, right? Whenever you're in a game of trying to predict what's coming, especially when we don't have a lot of data. Um, there's a lot of risk in that. But to Quinn's point about restaurants, we know we've got a lot of restaurants that are coming back. I know we probably have some entrepreneurs on the Zoom. The first person who figures out how to run a ghost kitchen in New Orleans, where all they're doing is making meals that folks know and love from various different restaurants that can no longer support brick and mortar, but they're heavily into um, Uber Eats or Grubhub or any of these other apps, and they've designed their facility to process orders quickly and get them out quickly and get them to the drivers quickly. The first group that figures out how to do that well is going to be ahead of the curve, right? The first folks who figure out how to get in the manufacturing game when it comes to either PPEs or vaccines or any other treatment for coronavirus or whatever virus or bio situation comes ahead are going to be ahead of the game, right? So we've got to figure out how to support those businesses that were designed for pre-March, because they need that as well. But to really get ahead of the curve, we've got to think about what's coming and take some risk, right? And do it fast. And I think we can turn it over to questions because I saw one pop up in the chat.
Yeah, we had a question for you, Nolan. Can you talk a little bit how your experience with the Young Leadership Council prepared you for tackling some of these larger economic issues?
Sure. It feels like it was so long ago, but the organization at the time, it's one of the interesting things about the Young Leadership Council is it could also have new in its name, right? Because every so often the organization just reinvents itself by cycling through leaders, right? You get unceremoniously booted out once you turn 40. It's an organization where leaders come from within. Everybody's a volunteer, but everybody's expected. If you have an idea or a project, you're expected to carry that forward, right? You don't get to just suggest it. You have to actually lead it and build it if you want to do it. And so I would say that would be lesson one. That if you got a great idea, you've got to propose it and you've got to be prepared to execute it. Lesson two is that you really get the opportunity to figure out how to create partnerships with different people. That's one of the things that the YLC in the last I'd say 10 years has really gotten good at. I think in 2008 or 2007 or so, we were talking about diversity committees, and I don't know if YLC still has a need for one of those. Just my personal reflection is that the organization has done a good job with that, and that helps people to understand how as you're addressing different changes in the communities, they impact different people. There's some things that require a lot of resources that are a huge lift, but if they only benefit one segment of the community, or it might sound great to a bunch of folks, right? There's some things that the YLCers who started the organization wanted us to do, but because we have become more diverse, we chose not to do those things because with those same resources, we could do something else that would have a greater benefit for the entire community. So I think it allows you to, one, it's helped me understand that if I've got an idea, I've got to execute it, got to be able to execute it, right? And also that you've got to be able to work with people from different backgrounds, and your ideas and the things that you're trying to do have to benefit different people. They can't just benefit people who look like you or who have the same interests as you.
Oh, makes sense. Thanks for that, Nolan. One other question. This one to I think both. So how can businesses and organizations unite to create a standard. So I guess kind of like a comfort level so that consumers can feel comfortable when they patronize the establishments. This is, being offered at the city and state level to a degree, but is there any sort of effort by the private businesses to do so that those folks can return not only from within New Orleans, but also tourism as well?
Yeah, I'll take an initial stab at it. So the short answer is yes. There is the Resilient Louisiana Commission that was launched by the governor. You have at the legislative level, I alluded to the reopening task force, that which I'm a member. And then at the local level, you have Mayor Cantrell has a reopening New Orleans advisory panel. The good news is that you have both the public and private sectors at the table actively working through a joint policy about how do you address this issue of psychological safety, which is what is really we're talking about in the question. I think what it's all the ultimate piece of this is that there are so many elements in the value chain. I think that we can do, and Mayor Cantrell has been very clear about this. She wants America to know that we are the safest city as it relates to socializing in a post COVID-19 world in America. That's where she's focused on. She wants to make sure the public health infrastructure is there, that the businesses are aware of how to open safely and productively. But then the question becomes, I gave you the statistic, 67% of patrons are not New Orleanians at our restaurant community. A lot of people take planes, fly to New Orleans. So what happens then? And I think these are challenging thoughts. Do we test everybody as soon as they get off the plane? Do we test them before they get into their Uber? Do we test them as soon as they get into the hotel? You get into privacy concerns about contract tracing and things of that nature. So this is unprecedented. So we are looking at the business community, and I think New Orleans, because it is one of the few places, not only in Louisiana, but in the US, that is truly an international city. New York is one, Chicago, San Francisco, Houston, to DC. These questions of how do you make sure that psychological safety, and really psychological safety varies upon the activity. There's a different level of psychological safety going get your nails done or going to a barber shop, something I haven't done in a while. No comments from you, Nolan.
I got clippers if
But
you need to borrow.
yes, exactly. But that's very different than if you could go to a restaurant that has outdoor dining, which is also very different from maybe your gym, a local golf club or tennis club or things of that nature. And then you also have to think about the workers who are working at these venues. A lot of them rely on public transit. So how do we safely test and make sure that public transit doesn't become a vector that spreads this? So that's a little bit more long-winded than I wanted to be, but it's a complicated question that you do see the private sector and the government coming together to figure out how to get to the psychological safety point.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that there are a lot of smart people trying to think about that. What I try to think about, and this isn't doom or gloom, it's just what gets me excited, is what happens if for all the reasons, the psychological hurdle, folks don't want to come, right? If the restaurant industry looks incredibly different for the next 15 years than what it looked like for the last 15 years, what do we do then, right? Because that doesn't have to be doom and gloom. There's a solution for that. I want to be on the let's try to figure out what that might look like side of this. I know when I was working for the Downtown Development District, and Quentin and I had this conversation via text this weekend. We promoted the development of a lot of residential units downtown, right? There were units that were supposedly being built or the workers who would work in the biomedical industry that we talked about earlier is still sort of developing in spite of it being on the tip of everybody's tongue for the last 15 years. What ended up happening with those units, even though they were developed with all the facilities and functions that you would expect for a residential unit or apartment building or a condo building, is they got turned into short-term rental because the hospitality industry was booming. So what happens to those, what could happen to those units over the next 5 years if we don't have the same hospitality climate, but at the same time, employers are telling folks that you can work remotely and you can work remotely for extended periods of time. And if that becomes the norm, could we go after, could we recruit, could we be a market for folks who want to stay 1 month at a time, 2 months at a time, 3 months at a time, so that they can come in, they can quarantine for their 14 days if that becomes the new normal, but then they're a part of the community and they're staying in what used to be a building that was dedicated to entirely short-term rental. If this becomes the new normal, and to Quentin's point, 67% of the restaurant visitors were from out of town, our tax structure is structured around that. So there's a sales tax increase in certain neighborhoods and in certain industries like restaurants for some folks that people found acceptable because they were promoted for hospitality folks or folks coming in from out of town. It was going to be a visitor who was paying that extra freight. If we want to promote more locals spending money, should we go the other way, right? Should we reduce it a penny? Does that have any impact? Should we reduce it 2 pennies? Should we create a sales tax holiday, right? So I think the innovation, you can find innovation on both sides. How do we address going back to normal? But I get really excited thinking about what a completely different scenario might look like.
Yeah, that is a very cool concept, echoed by a lot of folks on the chat too, privately. Quentin, Nolan, a question for you both. What would be your number one lesson learned, both here and maybe even after Katrina, if that's still relevant? And can you just kind of play out what that lesson taught you and how you might change something in the future? Quentin, maybe we'll start with you.
I will cop that I was not living in New Orleans in the aftermath of the tragedy of Katrina. But I think post-COVID-19, the number one lesson is you have to deal with the underlying conditions that predate it, that made you especially economic vulnerable in the first place. Everyone is suffering, as we've talked about. I mean, this is a global, unprecedented global economic crisis. Not even in world wars has the entire globe shuttered production or shuttered consumer spending. Even in the world, I mean, so this is really, truly, since maybe, I don't know what I know people talk about the 1917, 1918 Spanish flu, but I think I think it's apples and oranges. So I think that we have to think about what are the underlying vulnerabilities. And I think, as we've all talked about, is we have to think about a multi-generational strategy to do 3 things. 1, create a city of lifelong learners. 2, unlock risk capital and entrepreneurship across racial, gender, and sexual orientation and religious differences in our region. And I think the final thing is we have to figure out how to better connect New Orleans, or maybe better stated, get our friends in Baton Rouge who serve us in the state legislature more comfortable with thinking about the interests of New Orleans. What's good for New Orleans is overall good for the state. Because there are a lot of things a lot of investments that can be done at the state level that, while it may on the face disproportionately benefit New Orleans, it will benefit and accrue to the benefit of the entire state. Nolan's talked at length about bioinnovation, investing in those dollars. New Orleans is one of 17 US cities with 2 medical schools. taking advantage of that incredible, not only physical infrastructure, but talent infrastructure, and really doubling down on that and making state investments in that, because that's the only way that research, and one of the things that we should be researching is, vaccines, not only for COVID-19, but future pandemics. I think we also have to think about research to make us better able to respond to climate change. The last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Nolan is one thing that I didn't really recognize until probably a little over a year ago, not even then, maybe 9 months ago, is that climate change is really changing consumer behavior and consumer eating habits. When you think about a company like Beyond Meat, that was prior to COVID-19 $1 billion company, a lot of people are moving away from animal agriculture. So what does that portend for our restaurant business? What does it portend for food processing companies? What does it portend for how does a city like New Orleans respond to that? Since so much of our identity is really tied up in food and drink.
Yeah, I would just add that we have to make sure that we remember those specific lessons from Katrina. And so, we're thinking about, we stood up the gig fund, we're thinking about the impact specifically on musicians and culture bearers and folks. And one of the things that we learned from Hurricane Katrina was that the biggest impediment to musicians moving back home and being able to find sustainable employment as a musician was access to affordable housing, and the availability of venues to perform and earn a living in. Obviously, after Hurricane Katrina, housing stock was devastated, venues, physical buildings were devastated. We're going to face a similar scenario, especially around venues post-COVID, right? We know some restaurants, some bars, some venues are going to be challenged. How do we respond to that challenge if we know the biggest impediment to that industry being sustainable and providing sustainable employment is actual places for musicians, artists to show their wares, whether it's the galleries on Julia or throughout the city, or the various neighborhood bars and juke joints and places that some musicians perform at weekly that some of us have never heard of, right? We've got to make sure that those places still exist going forward. Or think about an entirely new way for musicians to earn revenue, which I think Quentin was getting at in his earlier comments. Can they all earn revenue online? Is that possible, right? The other thing I think we should be really mindful of is that the same neighborhoods that were hit hard by Hurricane Katrina seem to be hit the hardest by COVID. So you look at New Orleans East, you look at the Lower Ninth Ward, you look at where there's a economic disparity. Those neighborhoods suffered the longest and the hardest from Hurricane Katrina, and they're suffering the hardest right now from COVID. And so one of the things that we saw was the city needed some type of federal response and some type of response from the state. The city couldn't recover on its own. So that would be lesson number one. There has to be some type of federal aid or state response from the city. And I would encourage anyone who is comfortable advocating to advocate for that with their local representatives or any representative they feel like advocating or can advocate to. But when we get that aid from the state or from the federal government, we've got to make sure that it's dispersed equitably across the city. That was one of the biggest challenges of the immediate years following Hurricane Katrina, that some neighborhoods, particularly the downtown area where it saw a lot of investment and a lot of programs that were set up to really invest in areas that were harder hit, saw that money flow into areas that weren't. And so we've just got to make sure that when we do get that state and federal money, it is equitably spread across in a way that really emphasizes the neighborhoods that were hardest hit.
And I guess an immediate follow-up to that, how do you do that? I mean, is that just simply, again, advocating with your legislature to ensure that, or is there something where organizations can help there?
Yeah, some of it is advocating with the legislator. Part of it is in design, right? And so because we saw this, if you think about a program like the Road Home program and how that was designed, it had inequity in the design. right? It didn't take into consideration how much it would cost you to actually rebuild your home. It took into consideration what your assessed value was, which meant some neighborhoods, because that's a contributing factor to assessed value, were going to get more dollars than others. And that had a racial component to it, right? Because of the segregated nature just of how neighborhoods have developed over time. And so looking at the design of any sort of program on the front end to make sure that it's designed equitably is one thing. But then also having clear political will and intent, and I think we have that currently, that neighborhoods that have been disproportionately disinvested, and this is why the Business Alliance has its strategic neighborhood development program, which is something most economic development organizations don't have. But neighborhoods like New Orleans East, Lower Nine, Gertown, Holly Grove, Algiers, that haven't seen that haven't had the benefit of the growth that some other neighborhoods have had over the last 10 years, that those neighborhoods continue to be invested in, and that we do it strategically and intentionally, and that we take any dollars that come from COVID and we look at the heat maps of where zip codes where people were most impacted, and we make sure healthcare infrastructure is prioritized and job opportunities are prioritized in those neighborhoods.
Yep. We have two more questions here. I'll try to get them both in. One of them is we might be able to assume that a lot of companies and individuals might be leaving dense cities like New York, very dense cities. What can New Orleans do to kind of position itself to accept those individuals, to make it attractive for those businesses to maybe come to?
Yeah, I mean, I think Nolan has discussed some of those. Let me just focus on three. I think we need to make sure that we have really strong broadband connectivity, high-speed connectivity, because if people are going to be working remotely, they're going to need that. I think also electricity redundancy is going to be critically important as well, as people try to do Zoom meetings. But I also think it requires a certain overall embrace of technology, and realizing that technology will fundamentally change the nature of work. And think people have to be comfortable with that. I think that you can't say that you want technology companies, or you want, because really, if we're talking about it really are going to be knowledge sector companies, whether we define them formally as technology companies or not. It's really going to be companies in the knowledge sector. I think Nolan's concept of really becoming that place where the person who says, hey, look, I work for Twitter, and Twitter now says I don't have to go back into a physical environment. Hell, I can work anywhere in the world. I really love New Orleans. But I also really love Asheville, North Carolina. I also really love Charleston, South Carolina. How does New Orleans rise to top? Well, you got to make sure that those elements are in place. The intellectual infrastructure, you got to have good quality schools, because that concerns people. You also have to have good quality physical infrastructure, broadband, 5G, you name it. You have to have strong electricity. But at the same point, we have to figure out how to do all those things while still developing our homegrown talent. As someone who's chosen to be a New Orleanian, I tell people, I wasn't blessed enough to be born here, but I came here by choice. I also encounter people who say, hey, why, what about me? I grew up here. Why did you get that opportunity and I didn't? And so we have to make sure that we manage those tensions as well, and make sure that we cultivate and develop the folks who've been here for generations as well, all the while we attract new folks.
Yeah, I'll just add, we've got to look at sort of our incentive packages at the state level that have worked. The film tax credit, the film credits that were used to attract the DXCs and accruants and other companies locally. And we've got to see if we can apply those to emerging industries and broaden them out. And if we can get some willingness in Baton Rouge to be creative, recognizing that the state is going to be struggling a bit financially, but can we be creative with broadening and applying our incentive packages at the state level?
Thanks. We'll try to squeeze in one more. So from the New Orleans Business Alliance perspective, as well as the state task force, what are some sort of backup plans that might be in place? So let's say that a second wave does hit and it shuts down once again the hospitality industry, and the oil and gas stays suppressed. Is there sort of like a long-term? I mean, it sounds like I think y'all really articulated that laying the groundwork now and continuing that. But is there anything else that we could do to think a bit longer term here?
No, I mean that's the question that keeps me up at night. I think there are probably three things. One is we have to simultaneously live in the moment and meet people where they are. There's some people, a lot of people, who are not prepared to think long term yet, and we have to acknowledge and accept that. Not only political leaders, but our friends and neighbors every day. So we have to meet them where they are. They're still in immediate recovery, immediate relief mode. So that's one, because I think that's helpful. You got to acknowledge where people are on this journey. But the two things that I would say about how do you deal with a second is, I think, focusing on your public health infrastructure, making sure that you have testing. And New Orleans was one of the best in practice for mobile testing, increasing that, making sure that it goes to places that made people, a lot too many of our friends and neighbors don't have cars. So you got to go to where they are. I think the second thing that we have to do with regard to our public health infrastructure, we've got to work really hard and in a concerted way, and I know the administration is already doing this, with our higher ed community. We're one of the few cities in the state, really in the Gulf South region, that is truly an international global city. We have people from at least 60, 70, 80 different countries. And there are all types of public health regimes from those places. And so we have to think about, what does it mean to not only contact tracing, but contact isolation, quarantines, and things of that nature. And I think our ability to articulate the public health infrastructure that's prepared to respond will lead to greater psychological confidence that maybe will allow us to not have a complete, V-shaped recovery, but it can be more gradual, be more U-shaped. So I think those are practical things that we can do to respond if, and it's not even if, it's when. And if it's not a second wave of COVID-19, there will be something else. Pandemics, unfortunately, are going to be a part of our future. We've seen the rate and the velocity, whether it was SARS or H1N1 or Ebola. I mean, we can see it picking up. And so, unfortunately, until there's greater global public health infrastructure, and we also deal with some of the social determinants of health and have basic hygiene levels and things of that nature, we're going to have to make sure that the infrastructure is able to respond and restore public confidence.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can add anything to that. That was a great answer. I hear, I have a 4-year-old losing his mind in the background. I hear Dr. Avegno's comments, the city health director, of if we have a recurrence, then we go back to phase 0, right? Which is what we just came out of. And then I think I would suppose that we've learned a lot from being in phase 0, that we should hopefully be able to get through phase 0 quicker, but then we're back to phase 1. And then what does that impact on the psychology and on the larger economic environment? And I'm not sure that anybody has that answer yet, or the answer for my 4-year-old who is literally screaming in the background. And I don't know how well my noise cancellation works, but apologies.
Oh, good. Let's make sure that we make him available for you.
I don't want to go in the other room.
Too bad, you have to. No, we'll take this time to wrap up. Quentin, Nolan, I truly appreciate both of you taking time out of your very, very busy schedules to present and to answer these questions here. Certainly a lot of learning for myself as well as everyone on the call. We will send out a survey after this, and one has been sent out to all members of the Young Leadership Council, just asking how we as an organization can be a part of this recovery. So we are soliciting ideas from our members. So I wanted to highlight that for all the participants on the call today. But once again, thank you, Quentin. Thank you, Nolan. I appreciate all that you do for the city.
No, really grateful, and really, Young Leadership Council has been a tremendous organization. We're really grateful. And the last thing I would say is I hope that people, amid all the disappointment and discouragement, there is still hope. New Orleans, if there's any place in America that will be better and can figure out a way to be better on the other side of this tragedy, is New Orleans. So I would always say, be relentlessly optimistic and hopeful. And we are always open at the Business Alliance to your suggestions and thoughts.
The only thing I would just add, recalling the years immediately after Hurricane Katrina, is be prepared to work for it, right? This organization especially stepped up and worked for it, worked to be able to have the resources to buy that building, worked to be able to take over the Wednesdays at the Square from the Downtown Development District, and worked really at standing up all the programs that were so valuable to the community and making sure they were there in the post-Katrina environment, and really being proactive and thinking about what could be of service as we adjusted to that new normal. And it was hard work, right? And I recognize every member of the board and every member of the organization is a volunteer. But I would just say, be hopeful, to Quentin's point, and be prepared to work for it, because we're all going to have to work for it over the next several years.
Yeah, well said. I'm leaving motivated. I know everyone else on the call is too. I appreciate it. All right. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time. Have a
Thank
good
you.
day. Peace.